Thank you, Catherine, for that wonderfully kind introduction. And as you say, it's always great to have an excuse to come over to this side of the Isar River from where I usually sit at Global Disconnect. It's also, as a big fan of the Rachel Carlson Centre for many years, it's a real pleasure and honour to be with you today. So as Catherine mentioned, I would like to present some of the research today coming out of my current book project, which looks at scientific and cultural ideas about habitability, with a particular focus on imperial attempts to measure and define these, mostly in Central Asia. The Mesopotamia is more in the future now. I might start with a bit of scene setting. So in the 19th century, Central Asia often appears on, or in imperial imaginations as the setting for various geopolitical intrigues, part of the so-called Great Game, or as the so-called meeting point of the three empires of Russia, Qing China, and British India. At the same time, there was a growing scientific and environmental interest, and of particular fascination were a series of multicultural stories. So from Chinese pilgrims, from Islamic princes, and from Italian travellers, that told then stories of, or dramatic tales of wandering rivers and shifting sands that had abandoned and buried cities in the Taklamakan desert. By way of orientation, we have a satellite image that you might be able to see a little bit here on the slide. In the centre, we have the Tarim Basin, which is mostly what I'll be talking about today, featuring the Taklamakan and Lop deserts. So it's surrounded on three sides by high mountain ranges. So in the north, we have the Tian Shan, to the south, the Kunlun, in the west, the Pamir. To the northeast, it gives way then to the Gobi Desert, and of course this region is today surrounded or encompassed entirely, more or less, by the Xinjiang province of China. By wider orientation, we have the sweeping Himalaya, Karakoram coming through here, and in this corner is Afghanistan. So around the turn of the 20th century then, an eclectic cast of imperial explorers, geographers and archaeologists set out to locate the various rumoured lost cities of Central Asia. When they eventually uncovered abandoned towns, it quickly became apparent that many of them existed in places incapable of supporting similarly large populations under the environmental conditions of the present. And this was not easy to reconcile then with the emerging imperial imaginary that these places had supported supposedly one of the greatest trade routes in world history, that is the Silk Roads, the imperial imaginaries of which were in the making in the same period. So it seemed then that environmental conditions in Central Asia had changed, not only on the scale of geological or deep time, but also within recent human history. The discovery of dead cities and possible evidence that Central Asia was becoming less habitable and drier over time also fed then into anxiety in imperial circles about the filling in of the globe's last allegedly blank spaces at the turn of the 20th century, and concerns about demography within a closed world system. So in this context then, debates about the limits of habitability, how they might change, decreasing through environmental degradation or climatic change, but also expanding through imperial improvement or terraforming schemes and other technological interventions, take on heightened geopolitical and imperial resonance. So in the case of Central Asia then, or the Tarim Basin, historians have particularly looked at archaeological work, or as it's increasingly viewed, imperial plundering from the lost cities of the Tarim Basin. So including sites like Dandan Ulik, Lulan and Danhuang, and I have an image here. This is the famous slide taken of the manuscripts in the Danhuang caves, so the home of the Diamond Sutra and other well-preserved written records. So figures like the Hungarian-born British archaeologist Aurel Stein, who took this photograph, as well as the Swedish explorer Sven Hedin, become well known for their archaeological exploits, famous figures in their day and since, though somewhat still less well known is the way that environmental sciences and questions of climatic stability are central to their investigations, though this is changing, particularly with the work of another friend of the RCC, Philip Foray. So the talk I want to give today then is divided into three parts. I want to start with an overview of some of the ways that Central Asian landscapes call theories of climatic stability into question, the anxieties this raised around the turn of the 20th century. In the second part, I'll look at a key case study that I've been looking at recently, namely Lop Nor, so the famous wandering lake. And then in the final part of the talk, I want to widen this out and think about some of the ideas of climate change, desiccation, and migration that come out of these case studies, and ultimately why understanding the imperial legacies of these surveys and categories matters today. So in the project then, I'm especially interested in tracing imperial knowledge of environmental change and the way it's always refracted through a series of multicultural records. So of particular importance were, as I mentioned, travellers of Chinese Buddhist travellers or travelogues. So Xuanzang, for example, travels along the edge of the Taklamakan Desert in the 7th century, recounts a series of religious parables about towns buried by inhabitants that show insufficient piety, but also provides a wealth of information about historical, demographic, and environmental change. Another significant account is the 16th century account of the Duglat prince and later ruler of Kashmir, Ms. Muhammad Haidar. And so, in his account, the Tariq al-Rashidi, then Haidar notes tales of hunters who go into the desert after wild camels and relate that they sometimes come across the foundations of cities that are visible when they return a short time afterwards. No trace of these is to be found, for the sanders again overwhelmed them. And so on a scale of these cities, or were these cities of which nowadays neither vestige nor trace remains. So 19th and 20th century surveyors and geographers recognise the value of these accounts, and they try and reconcile and extract the information they contain and place those alongside their scientific observations and measurements. And so really in nearly all cases, rather than discovering lost cities for the first time, these geographers are participating in a much longer story then. And this is particularly true because as well as multicultural written records, travellers like Stein and Hayden are building on the practices of so-called treasure seekers, and many of the ruins have already been systematically explored by Central Asian people long prior to European interest and searching for gold or valuable items in particular. And so the archaeologists and geographers then try and attempt and co-opt these existing networks that already see the desert ruins, albeit for different ends, or at least they claim these are different ends, and there's a lot of rhetorical work done in their accounts to claim that European archaeology is somehow different from and essentially superior to local practices of treasure seeking. So these networks and questions of labour are an important part of all my work really, and it's something that I'll pick up on a little bit later. So as well as moving sands, evidence of environmental disasters, these buried cities also provide evidence of wider environmental change, particularly so-called terminal oases, so sites found further out in the desert than is reached by the glacier-fed rivers of the turn of the 20th century, so suggesting an overall reduction of the water supply. And this is one example here from Stein. So this is dunes and dead vegetation beyond the terminal course of the Carrier River. So particularly on the southern rim of the desert, there's a lot of evidence that the rivers no longer flow as far into the desert as they had maybe 1,000 years earlier. Sven Hayden, meanwhile, was particularly interested in understanding the cause and timing of the abandonment of these various towns. And as he would muse upon uncovering the ruins of Dan and Ulik, which becomes one of the key sites, he says, at what period was this mysterious city inhabited? When did its last crop of russet apple or apricots ripen in the sun? When did the sour green leaves of its poplars yellow for the last fall? When were the trickling hum of its mill wheel silence forever? When did its despairing people finally abandon their dwellings to the ravenous maw of the desert king? As an aside, it's kind of hard not to read this from the perspective of the present, thinking about our own future and wondering about our own mill wheels. So let me turn now to my kind of key case study for the day, and one of the most dramatic examples of environmental change in Central Asia. And so in the 19th century, long-standing rumours of a large lake in the desert provide the material then for a particularly vexing geographical problem. So this lake, or Lop Nor, would go on to become a key site for imperial speculations about environmental and climatic stability over a range of timescales. To do so, though, it first had to be found. And this proves not quite so straightforward, which is something similarly true of the ancient city of Lulan, which Chinese chronicles indicated had been located on the shores of Lop Nor, but abandoned some 1,500 years previously. So theories about Lop Nor then and its demise around the 4th century CE become important to this question about the changing habitability of Central Asia over time. Debates about the mystery then of Lop Nor also shared some interesting insight, I think, into the history of imperial geography. So particularly the importance of romanticised geographical problems, and here then Lop Nor echoes famous cases of the 19th century, so attempts to locate the source of the Nile or the Northwest Passage. So tracing these problems then gives interesting insights into the development and codification of geography then as both an imperial science and an academic discipline. So the German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen, often credited then with inaugurating or coining the term Silk Roads by the German, so Siebenstraßen, in the 1870s, notes that Lop Nor has been known about as far back as Ptolemy in European geography, even if, as he says, by the mid-19th century, the conclusive solution to all of our questions appears to be very different. For Lop Nor lay exactly in the centre of an extensive region of Asia, entirely beyond the reach of the European explorer. So framed in this way then, Lop Nor serves as a provocation, a tantalising geographical problem in want of empirical confirmation. So much then as inscribing blank spaces onto maps in cartography overwrites existing indigenous topographies and presences, so too do geographical problems serve to drive exploration and ultimately imperial appropriation. So if European imperial knowledge is sparse, Lop Nor is nevertheless far from unchronicled, particularly in Chinese accounts. And summarising the records, George Macartney, a really interesting figure, actually was the long-serving British consul at Kashgar, which was the kind of largest city at the western end of the Tarim Basin. And he summarises these chronicles and gives information, including from the Xian Han Shu, or the Book of Han, where he tells us the lake is referred to as Puchang Hai, literally the calamiferous lake, also called the salt marsh. And so here there's a kind of key bit of information which becomes central over the debates about the identification of the lake, namely that it's salty. So in the second half of the 19th century then, imperial knowledge remains dependent on a set of multicultural written records, historical records, and these ultimately then are insufficient for the evolving aims of imperial geographical science. So the problem, as it was discussed, of Lop Nor is then thrust further into the spotlight by the attentions of the Russian explorer Nikolai Przhevalsky, who believes he found the lake in 1877, though his announcement proves ultimately not to be quite so straightforward. And he actually identifies two lakes, suggesting that one of them must be the historical lake of the Chinese accounts. But geographical observers, particularly Richthofen, quickly point out that his identification doesn't quite add up. And so this is a map, again it's a little bit hard to see perhaps, but this is a map produced by Richthofen, and it shows Chinese and Przhevalsky's geography. So we have a Chinese map produced in red, and then Przhevalsky's overlaid in black, and the two Lop Nors are here, so separated by almost a whole degree of latitude, illustrating kind of the scale of the problem. Adding to the doubts then is that Przhevalsky reports that the water is actually sweet, not salty. So Przhevalsky goes on to provide a response to Richthofen. He critiques the German geographer's over-reliance on Chinese accounts, and he also brings in questions or discussions of indigenous nomenclature. And so he says that the circumstances of natives not knowing or not employing the term Lop Nor for the lakes is not surprising, as this refers to the whole to the whole kind of region by the by the people in the inhabited district of Karakul. So these debates then elevate ultimately Lop Nor to kind of one of the upper strata then of unsolved geographical problems. But the name potentially most famously associated with the lake is that of Sven Hedin. Looking back then in a popular account which he writes in 1940, Hedin highlights the contributions of Przewalski as his predecessor, and he goes on then to quote from Petermann's Mitteilungen. So this is a influential geographical magazine, and he says that Przewalski's discoveries create an extraordinary sensation, and actually, even if not all of his conclusions are right, in this respect, it still ranks equally among journeys equally to the solution of such famous problems as the crossing of Australia, the reaching of the North Pole or Timbuktu, discovery of the Nile, and on and on. So again, this indicates then the importance of sensational and sensationalizable geographical problems to European imperial practice. So over a period spanning about 4 decades, Hedin makes multiple visits to the Tarim Basin, and he goes on then to follow Richthofen's critiques, right? He says, Przewalski has not found the historical Lop Nor of the Chinese, but instead a newly formed lake, namely the Karak Ocean. And he goes on then to claim that the Lop Nor problem remains unsolved, opening up, of course, space for his own forthcoming denouement. So here he proposes a theory that might explain the difficulties, reconcile the historical and contemporary accounts, namely the idea of a wandering lake. So he essentially argues that the solution to the problem of the lake not being found where expected is that it had actually moved quite dramatically between the northern and southern parts of the desert. And in 1901, he took a series of levels then to measure elevational differences and see that these are small enough for the lake's movement. And he goes on then to calculate that the height was only 2.28 metres, so this is his profile, between the two parts of the desert, and explains it's this remarkable horizontality. And so not only have I gone from mountains to deserts, I've gone from verticality to horizontality, which in combination then with silting and wind erosion are what allows the lake to migrate from the different parts of the desert. So let me turn and connect this back to the question of lost cities and environmental change then. So closely associated with the city of Lop Nor was always, the lake of Lop Nor was always the city of Lulan. And so the ruins, or the discovery of the ruins of this city, an important archaeological desideratum by 1900, ultimately made by accident. And as Hedin recounts it, the discovery was actually made by a Loplik named Ordek, who we see here on the slide. So Hedin explains that one day in 1900, his men realised their spade was missing. Ordek, who was apparently responsible for getting it, offers to go back and find it. But a storm comes up, and Hedin writes, he lost our trail, got astray, and finally comes to a Torah, a landmark tower in the vicinity of which he discovered several houses. And the way that Hedin chooses to tell this story then is interesting, right? It's a kind of classic example of indicating the complexity of this dependence on Central Asian labour. So he does give Ordek credit as the discoverer of Lulan, but he also undercuts his agency by emphasising the accidental nature of the find. On reaching the desert site then, Hedin kind of gets characteristically carried away, and he says, look upon that picture and then look upon the picture of the scene as it is now, an endless array of cenotaphs. We also see an image of that here on the slide. He goes on to uncover documents to help him date the ruins, and he then says Lulan flourishes between about 200 BCE to around 330 CE. And he goes on to consider a mix of natural and cultural factors in the town's initial abandonment. Says even if political and military changes were contributory to the cause of the evacuation of the town, it was the movement of the lake that ultimately provides or presents absolutely insuperable obstacles to the continuance of human life. So here Lulan sees, and the other lost cities in fact, see geographers weighing natural and cultural factors with greater and lesser degrees of nuance, echoing a long and often quite insidious history of environmentally determinist explanations for civilizational success and decline, which is a theme that I'll pick up on in a couple of minutes. So, of course, however mysterious the lake might have been to the Imperial geographers and archaeologists, the Lop Desert has long been known to the Lopliks like Ordek, who are Turkic dialect-speaking people who lived in the area. And actually, much of the early Imperial knowledge of the lake and later theories about its peripatetic movements rely heavily on local testimony about environmental change. And so here, existing notions of habitability and change then continue to inform and contest Imperial categorizations of Central Asian deserts. So indigenous knowledge was again applied to questions of nomenclature to trace environmental change. And so in mapping the shifting hydrography, Hayden explains that the names of the natives are not without value geographically. They're interesting as documents. I would wager that within 20 years, nearly all the names I've recorded will have disappeared or been forgotten, but some of them would be in use. So something like Usan Cole, the Long Lake, Yangi Cole, the New Lake being characteristic names, but they'd almost certainly be applied to different sheets of water. And so he says the names become, like the lakes themselves, overgrown with reeds. New basins come into existence and acquire new names. These quotes then, or these studies, indicate clearly that Lopliks maintain flexible topographical frameworks and further indicate then that the changeable nature of the hydrography has long been understood by those who live by its whims. In tracing the habitability of the Lop Desert more widely, geographers rely on intergenerational oral knowledge to map shifts over time. So Hayden explains in his observations about the formation of the Karakoshan, so the lake in the southern part of the desert. He says these confirm observations given to me in 1896 by Przewalski's old friend, the octogenarian chief, Kuchkin Beg, who told me his father, Nutmut Beg, had lived in his youth by a big lake situated north of Karakoshan, and that the last named had been not formed until 1720 or 1730. So Hayden and Przewalski agreed, both disagreed, but they deployed intergenerational oral knowledge in support of their arguments, and in the case of Kuchkin Beg, they're actually relying on the same man. Oral Stein, Sven Hayden, the American geographer Ellsworth Huntington, the Japanese explorer Zuchio Tachibana, the later Swedish archaeologist Folke Bergman. They all also rely on a Loplik named Dr. Aiken, who is himself the son of Kuchkin Beg. And so on the slide we actually see second from the right is Dr. Aiken. Standing next to him is Kuchkin Beg's widow, although we don't know her name. So this sort of image then indicates the intergenerational networks that geographers rely on. But it's also this sort of ethnographic photograph or type photograph also serves to reinforce then these environmentally determinist stereotypes as the Lopliks as a people outside of time and civilizational advancement. So Oral Stein, meanwhile, goes on to talk about the information that he gains from Muller and Dr. Aiken about notable changes occurring. And he says the men knew the Yangi Coal Depression since their youth from hunting expeditions and could recall having seen its western edge where it was marked by rows of dead tokraks, so poplar trees, and said that their fathers had told them that these basins had formerly held water for certain periods. The total absence of vegetation in certain intervening depressions is then attributed to them by the depth of water once held. So they provide not only information about the changes, but also explanations for why they've occurred. And so Dr. Aiken has a very long career then, as a kind of go-to expert and guide, one which ultimately spans several decades, and indicates the way that then Central Asian people are not only subjected to imperial surveys, but might actively adapt to exploit economic and other possibilities. However, violent the overall overarching imperial processes nevertheless remain. And so as the factotum then on an eclectic array of expeditions, Dr. Aiken's contributions are, in my opinion, far more fundamental than mere assistance. And he actually spends much more time than any of Stein, Hayden, Bergman, Tachibana or Huntington investigating the desert sites. And we might say then that the most experienced expert in the ruined, or the ruins of the Lob Desert is arguably not an imperial scientist or geographer at all. Okay, let me step back to pick up Hayden's wandering lake theory now. So when he suggested its predictive capacity, it's unclear if he truly entertained the idea that the lake might wander, again, within his own lifetime. But it does. So beginning in 1921, the water that had fed the Southern Depression, so the Karakoshan of Przewalski, shifts northward and resurrects the Kurukdaria, literally the dry river, which has not flowed for a millennium and a half, and fills up the dried up Lop Nor once more. And so the drama of these changes then is reinforced when Hayden makes his final trip to Central Asia. And in 1934, he travels along the resurrected Kurukdaria to the newly refilled Lop Nor. And so this is in contrast, this is the image from his first trip, where he travels by camel and foot along the dry riverbed, and in 1934 he travels along a vast flowing river by canoe and raft. And so really the kind of, the change, it could hardly have been starker. Here Hayden keeps an eye on the future, and he suggests that the resurrection of Lop Nor prepares the ground then for new life and colonisation. So Lulan and its villages could blossom anew, and traffic on the old Silk Roads begin again. This vision then has obvious geopolitical implications, and Hayden notes that then it's a remarkable geographical and hydrographical event that has put the means in the hands of the Chinese government to open up the old line of communication to traffic again. And so Hayden actually goes on to leverage this resurrection of Lop Nor, prepares a document he calls a plan for the revival of the Silk Roads. This is later formally submitted to Chiang Kai-shek's new nationalist government in Nanking, and it's part of a complex web of obligations and permissions that allow his very deliberately monikered Sino-Swedish expedition access to the Tarim Basin in the 1930s, at a time where foreign interference is becoming less welcomed. So these debates then, and particularly in this plan of the Silk Road, show that imperial imaginaries and theories of climates are developed in tandem in this period, but also the way that scientific questions about shifts in habitability are always linked then to wider imperial and political interests. And it's also worth remembering that the Silk Roads are popularised in this period in tandem then with, as Justin Jacobs argues, imperial attempts to gain influence in Central Asia and impose political and economic claims upon the lands and people of Xinjiang. So these romantic visions then of the Silk Roads, of connections in world history, are ultimately inseparable from fraught political questions then about the fate of Turkic-speaking peoples in Xinjiang today. And really the lost cities of the Tarim shows that this has long been a long multicultural space of lives, of exchanges, and perhaps one day it can be again. Let me finish then the story of Lop Nor before turning to the wider questions of climate change and stability it informs. So towards the end of his life, Hayden says we've solved the Lop Nor problem, at least so far as it can be solved now, and it will be for the remote future to see the next swing of the pendulum. Here he's again wrong, and the story of Lop Nor has another twist in the tale then. So this lake, over which so much imperial geographical debate and ink was spilt, exists no more. And human intervention, so exploitation of water resources, particularly dams upstream, mean that Lop Nor no longer now exists in either the northern or southern part of the desert. So it dried up in the 1960s again and has remained since, with this diversion of water, now exacerbated by anthropogenic climate change, shrinking the glaciers that feed the rivers of the Tarim Basin. Okay, the third and slightly shorter final part of the talk then. As well as tracing shifting sands, wandering lakes and rivers, imperial scientists also link these geographical case studies to bigger questions of regional and later global climatic change. So here the question was really, was Central Asia becoming less habitable overall than it had been when these various towns had been abandoned? And so Central Asia becomes key to wider questions, and particularly to contested theories of desiccation. So the idea that parts of the earth are becoming drier over time. And these debates then were global. So the Central Asian cases I've talked about today are compared to others in Australia and Southern Africa, in the United States. In the Tarim Basin then, a variety of theories and weightings for climatic factors in these environmental changes are offered. Sven Hayden is, for example, on one side firmly against the idea of changes within human history. So he argues that Lochner's oscillations then are dependent entirely upon chance hydrographical changes driven by the wind. It would be a grave mistake to attempt to harmonise the periodical variations either with the Bruckner periods or with any other secular changes of climate. Orelstein is a bit more ambivalent, and he explains that changes to the water supply must be connected to some general desiccation affecting the whole of Central Asia, probably most regions of the continent, if not the whole Earth. But he also says, he goes on to say it would be a mistake to try and interpret developments in history based on conjecturally determined change of climate. So while Hayden opposes, Stein grapples with some of the complexities, others were less reticent. And that brings us to the American geographer Ellsworth Huntington, who visits Central Asia in 2 expeditions, so in 1903 and again in 1905 and 6. And he goes on to write a number of books on climate history, including his first, so in 1907, The Pulse of Asia, and this gives some indication of the scope or ambition of the work. And he says, this book is a record of a journey in Central Asia. Its aim is to illustrate the geographical relation between the physical environment of man and between changes of climate and history. So he initially argues strongly for progressive desiccation, the idea that it's becoming gradually drier over time, but then he modifies this later into an argument of cyclical, or as he calls it, pulsatory climatic changes. So while searching then for evidence for this theory, Huntington traces the primary cause of the abandonment of the cities. And this is actually a page of his notebook where he has listed all of the major rivers of the southern part of the Tarim Basin and the ruined sites found along them. And he then compares a variety of natural and cultural factors in the apparent abandonment of the towns. So he lists desiccation as a factor in each, but he also puts other things like rising salinity of the soil due to agriculture or war or political failures. He then goes on to combine these scientific surveys, ancient written records, the knowledge of Central Asian guides, including Dr. Aiken, into sweeping forms of environmentally determinist analysis, where everything from civilizational attainment to racial characteristics are seen as almost entirely attributable to climate. And this culminates then in his kind of famous, or really more notorious, graphs of energy and climate. So he has the distribution of civilization at the bottom and the distribution of energy at the top. And surprise, surprise, that Europe and North America are seen as having both the best climate and being apparently the most civilized. So this is part of this wider and ongoing attempt to justify imperial dominance. So Huntington has really attracted considerable scrutiny since by geographers dealing with the dark past of their discipline, also from historians, where he's seen, and not really unfairly, as the apogee of Eurocentric and racist, environmentally determinist thinking in the early 20th century. Although his work wasn't uncontroversial in his own time, as seen in his kind of long attempt to secure a professorship at Yale, ultimately unsuccessfully, where he nevertheless had a long career there. So as well as by these imperial geographers who travelled in the desert, these questions of regional and global desiccation are taken up by others, and the lost cities of the Tarim Basin become central to debates on climate change writ large. So a notable figure here was the Russian anarchist, scientist, Prince Peter Kropotkin. He gave a famous lecture on the title of The Desiccation of Eurasia in 1904. And this, he says, altogether it's quite certain that within historical times, East Turkestan and Central Mongolia have not been the deserts they are now. They've had a numerous population, advanced in civilization, which stood in a lively intercourse with different parts of Asia. So these questions then, investigations of collapses that occurred when inhabited places become uninhabitable, are also linked to grandiose questions around societal breakdown and particularly migration. And another geographer, geologist and explorer, John Walter Gregory, goes on to summarise some of these in an article from 1914. And he says that, here he's looking at Kropotkin, he says, many of the geographical changes have been proved by unmistakable evidence, and according to Prince Kropotkin, occasioned some of the great historic movements among men. Thus, he attributes the overthrow of the Roman Empire to dwindling rainfall of Central Asia, which turned tribes of agricultural nomads, agriculturists into nomads by the repeated failure of their crops, and finally drove the drought-stricken barbarians into Europe, owing to their own lands having become uninhabitable. So Gregory remains unsure if these imply universal changes. It's only becoming understood then that some of these climatic changes might be global rather than only regional. But even as he grapples then with the possibilities, Gregory clearly understands that changing habitability can have vast societal consequences. So I should probably start to wrap up. These have just been a couple of examples then from the current book project I'm working on, which looks at various ways that surveyors, archaeologists, geographers attempt to measure and define the habitability of environments in Central Asia then, even as it's increasingly clear that these climatic categories might be unstable over a range of timescales. So here, romanticised geographical problems like Lop Nor, like the lost cities of Central Asia, are leveraged by imperial geographers to a variety of ends. So these problems were interpreted as provocations to repel imperial investigation and attempts ultimately at the appropriation of land, landscapes and people. And this is despite the way that from the discovery of the ruins of Lulan by the Loplik Ordek to the theories of environmental stability that rely on the knowledge of Dr. Aiken, knowledge of changing habitability around the 20th century was made and indeed could only be made by a diverse range of actors. So drawing in multicultural historical records, intergenerational oral knowledge, and the contemporary Central Asian expertise and labour. So these geographical appropriations then were also heavily entangled with the development of imperial imaginaries of the Silk Roads. And here the stark contrasts raised questions of habitability and climatic stability, not only in geological time, but also within recent human history. And so the examples I've given today point to some of the irreconcilable claims about historical and future climate change at the turn of the 20th century, but they also show how these definitions reflect geopolitical ambitions and anxieties, especially if or when stability is not assumed. So more widely then in this project, I'm trying to think through, and maybe you can all help me do this, habitability as an imperial category. So the sixth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, warns in quite stark terms then that many long inhabited parts of the world are now on course to become uninhabitable. So while the large-scale effects of anthropogenic climate change are new, divisions of the world into habitable and uninhabitable regions are, however, not, and have long shaped human and social relationships. So as we've seen in the case of Central Asia, definitions of habitability then have never been free from cultural bias and political interest. So really, thinking about the research at its broadest level, as astronomers continue to search the universe for new habitable planets, as increasingly dubious billionaires speculate about terraforming Mars, it's just as important, I would argue, to historicise cultural and scientific ideas about the changing limits of habitability on this one. So understanding imperial questions of changing habitability and their post-colonial legacies is also, I would say, essential to countering occurrence of racist and neo-determinist thinking in some parts of the media today, for example, in language around climate migration and refugees, or in the case of so-called climate conflicts like Syria or Sudan, and we certainly see echoes of this more than we'd like. So ultimately, putting scientific and cultural ideas of habitability into their historical context allows for reflection when scientific disciplines like geography and climatology in the making, but also allows us to consider the considerable extent to which imperial categories, which we might now take for granted, still shape our geographical and environmental imaginations today as we face our own climate change futures. So, thank you.